Folks, it is an honor to be here with you all again, once again, and thank you, Mike, for organizing this. Much appreciated. This is, as Mike talked about, I'm going to be talking about command and control during the both the Chickamauga campaign and the battle itself. The battle took place 18 through 20 September 1863. Oh, let me go to slideshow. Hold on here. Okay, this is the agenda I'm going to be following. I'm going to be looking at it from the prism of modern day doctrinal terms in terms of command and control. You see there, I'll go over task organization and then some examples of command and control during both the campaign and the battle. And so as you look here at the mission command and what command and control is defined as, and you see command authority of that commander that lawfully exercises over subordinates by virtue of rank or assignment. And we all know in the Civil War that rank and assignment, or rank rather, certainly played a big deal in the Civil War hierarchy of command. And you look at control, the regulation of forces and warfighting functions to accomplish a mission in accordance with the commander's intent. And we're going to take a look at both William Rosecrans's intent as well as Braxton Bragg, the Confederate commander, during his time. And I'm going to be looking at specifically these elements of both command and elements of control. You see those at the bottom of your slide. Well, folks, I'm going to go back about 30 years. This is my platoon in the Valley of Death outside of Kuwait City. During the after the ground war started in 1991, I was a young platoon leader in the 14th Infantry Brigade supporting the 5th Corps General Franks. And that's a picture I took there of my platoon going through gathering up prisoners of war. And I want to start off my presentation with kind of a vignette that I think will be sort of germane to what I'm going to be talking about the rest of this evening. And that is this unit here, 1st Cav Division out of, I guess, what used to be Fort Hood, Desert Storm. I see their patch there. And the reason I bring this up is when the ground war started in January of 1991, the commanding general for the 1st Cav Division walked into his tactical CP. For divisions and corps, you had a main CP and a tactical CP, which was much more mobile, much more forward towards the front lines. Anyway, the commanding general walks into his tactical CP, sits at his desk, and pulls out a deck of cards and begins to play solitaire. And this is the ground war had just commenced. And looking around, he saw all of his staff members at the maps and calling down the subordinate units, trying to gather information, tracking units on their maps. And what the general's purpose in doing that is, folks, if you look at these elements of command and control down at the bottom, the general was saying to his staff, folks, we have done everything that we needed to have done to ensure success. We have provided direction. We have gotten feedback from our commanders on how they're going to execute our missions. We've gathered information, intelligence. We've communicated my intent down to subordinate units. Decision-making, responsibility, his authority, and certainly his leadership. And so I think that's very, very much appropriate to start off with that, because we're going to talk about things here tonight very similar in these elements of command and control. And I'm going to be talking about those as we go through the presentation. Okay, we have the Army of the Cumberland, William General Rosecrans, Old Rosie as he was called, 1842 graduate of West Point, a devout Roman Catholic, and a war Democrat. And you see below there his 5 corps commanders. Of course, Major General George Thomas, 1840 graduate of West Point, a Virginian, as you probably know. His sister so distraught that he stayed with the Union that when he departed and did not join the Confederacy, that turned his picture around. And they said later that our brother died to us when he decided not to join the Confederacy. And of course, he died. When he passed away, he was buried in New York. No family members attended his funeral. Have Alexander McCook of the Fighting McCooks, the 20th Corps. Major General Thomas Crittenden, who is the only non-West Pointer amongst the group. And then we have General Stanley, the Cavalry Corps, and General Gordon Granger, certainly bringing up with the Reserve Corps. For the Army of Tennessee, Braxton Bragg, and bringing all the baggage that you're probably all aware of, his in command, things we're going to be talking about, and probably some names here that are not unfamiliar to many of you. Of course, Leonidas Polk, who was certainly the Episcopalian bishop, killed at the Battle of Pine Mountain, not far from Kennesaw Mountain, when he hugged a cannon shell to his chest. Daniel Hill, D.H. Hill, you certainly had familiar with Robert E. Lee's operations. William Walker Reserve Corps. Simon Buckner had come down from Knoxville to join Bragg's army. He had been up there in East Tennessee. And of course, James Longstreet coming down from Virginia with Lafayette McLaws' division, as well as John Bell Hood, though he was wounded at Gettysburg, as you know, and would be wounded again at Chickamauga, losing his right leg. And 2 cavalry corps. Now, it's interesting because Joseph Wheeler and Nathan Bedford Forrest did not get along with each other. Surprise, surprise. So Braxton Bragg had to keep those 2 apart, keep them separated with different missions, etc. Okay, so some orientation here, folks. Here we have Chattanooga right here, right there toward the right center. And if you look right here, this is Lee and Gordon's Mill, where I'm got the pointer. And just north of that is the Chickamauga battlefield. So that's where the fight's going to take place, 18th, 19th, and 20th. Have Sand Mountain here, Lookout Mountain right here. So some certainly robust mountain ranges that they're going to have to deal with. And certainly they're coming from Nashville area. Murfreesboro, the Tullahoma campaign started in June of '63. And a highlight here, of course, the importance of the railroads. Coming out of Chattanooga, going to Knoxville, going to Cleveland, Tennessee, going back up to Nashville, and then down on to Atlanta. So the importance there. And so we look at this aspect of control here. We look at information. Information defined as the available to the commander to make effective decisions critical to success during operations. Now, Braxton Bragg had roughly about 11,000 cavalry troopers in his command. When Simon Buckner came down from Knoxville, he brought with him about 4,500. So you're looking at roughly about 15,000 troopers on horseback. Not bad. But they had to screen almost 200 miles of frontage of the Tennessee River. A robust task for anybody. But in theory, Rosecrans' best plan would be to cross the Tennessee River north of Chattanooga up here, between Chattanooga and Knoxville, linking up with good old Ambrose Burnside's Army of the Ohio, which had taken Knoxville in early September. It makes sense, military sense, that these 2 Union forces would link up. Quite the force they would be, and the Confederates expected them to do just that. Well, Wheeler and Forrest, like I mentioned, attested each other. Bragg kept them separated. Forrest was on the right flank. Wheeler had roughly about 7,000 troopers to really cover this area right here. Okay, 7,000. However, he assigned just 2 regiments, 8th Cavalry right here and the 3rd Cavalry Regiment right here. Less than 800 troopers to patrol 90 miles. 90 miles. Incredible. The rest of his command took up camp miles away from the front. He was out doing recruiting duties, trying to gather more horses for his command, but he was in no position whatsoever to provide critical information and actionable intelligence to Bragg. Rosecrans, meanwhile, his plans worked perfectly. Sends 4 brigades up around north of the Chattanooga area, 2 infantry, 1 cav, and of course, John Wilder's famous Mounted Infantry Brigade. Main crossings of the Tennessee River begin on August 29th. So much so, Bragg is so much so worried about this threat to the north that he orders Wheeler to send his strongest cavalry division to support Forrest, leaving him with even less troopers. And again, the plan Thomas is going to move. Thomas is going to move in that direction here because Chattanooga was not necessarily his sole objective. Again, I'll highlight the railroads right here. Right here. McCook is going to go down further south, maybe even towards Rome, Georgia. Thomas Crittenden's 21st Corps hanging around Chattanooga and north of Chattanooga. Serious lack of information, but it forces Bragg to withdraw from Chattanooga. On September 2nd, Army Chief of Staff General McCall sends a note to General Wheeler. Says, quote, "Dear General, I am uneasy about the state of affairs. It is so vitally important that the General, Bragg, should have full and correct information. One misstep in the movement of this army would possibly be fatal. The passage of the ferry broke the line and a week has passed and we do not know whether or not any army has passed." Bragg orders the evacuation of Chattanooga on September 7th, and 2 days later, the Union occupies the city. William Glenn Robertson, in his book, River of Death, says this, quote, "Since July," and I pointed out these 2 small regiments that had patrolled west of Chattanooga. He said these 2 small regiments had picketed the Army's left flank, and there apparently was no system to notify Bragg in a timely fashion, again, if that line was penetrated. Wheeler apparently had nothing of any reports he received and seems to have been out of communications with Bragg until he reached Chattanooga on September 2nd. So there we have. Wheeler is so far from the front, does not provide that information to Bragg, and certainly in a timely manner in any semblance of cohesion or organization. And certainly the Union Army is able to cross the Tennessee River. And even further, if you jump forward about 2.5 weeks to the first day of the Chickamauga battle on September 18th, as Bragg crosses, and I'll point out the next slide, as Bragg crosses the West Chickamauga Creek to get into position to drive the Union Army south in McLemore's Cove, Bedford Forrest has taken his units back across the river. Just a minor point here, he had left Bragg's right flank totally exposed by doing so. But again, that's just an example, the criticality of information when it comes to providing that to the commander, in this case Bragg, and where they failed in this instance. Now, the next part we're going to talk about here is McLemore's Cove. And again, orientation here, folks. This is Lee and Gordon's Mill. And again, the battlefield, this is West Chickamauga Creek. And the Chickamauga battlefield is north of here. This is Davis's Crossroads. And this is Lookout Mountain. When you look at authority, we're going to examine this aspect of it. You look at authority, the authority to assign tasks and responsibility for their successful completion. By September 10th, the bulk of Bragg's forces were around Lee and Gordon's Mills, just south of the battlefield. Bragg had received information that a Union force had descended the eastern face of Lookout Mountain to the valley known as McLemore's Cove, which is what we're seeing here. McLemore's Cove. And this is Lookout Mountain in this direction back here. This is James Negley's division, about 4,500 strong. They come down on the eastern face of the mountain. Perhaps, Bragg thinks, there is an opportunity here. McCook, Thomas, and Crittenden's Corps are separated by miles, dozens of miles. So the ability here to strike this lone unit that's separated from the main force, something that just can't pass up. But Bragg was concerned. He now had units to his north, to his south, and now to his west. James Negley's division, 2nd Division of the 14th Corps of Thomas's. Bragg had roughly about 40,000 infantry around an 8-mile area east of Pigeon Mountain. You see Pigeon Mountain right here, further east. Polk had assigned Thomas Hyman's division, which was the largest division of Leonidas' Polk's Corps, to tackle this task, along with his good friend, Patrick Cleburne's division from Hill's Corps. Now, Hyman was aggressive, but he was not part of the established anti-Bragg faction or coalition that had grown pretty much since the fall of '62. He had joined Bragg's army on August 13th, so he was relatively new. He was known as an aggressive commander again, but perhaps Bragg chose him because of his both of his reputation as a fighter, but also because he was so new to the command. Again, not part of that anti-Bragg faction. Anyway, Bragg and Hyman meet at 10 o'clock in the evening on September 9th. Hyman is to move south right here, rendezvous with Cleburne's command at Davis's Crossroads, and then drive west and pin Negley's division against Lookout Mountain. About 12,000 soldiers, almost 2 to 3 to 1 superiority in numbers. Not bad. Except for September 10th. September 10th comes. Cleburne's men, however, are spread out, conducting numerous other tasks. But Cleburne was also very sick. D.H. Hill, who was Cleburne's boss, recommended, hey, boss, either postpone this until the 11th or cancel it altogether. But you look at information and a chain of command and passing communications around. This guy here, Thomas Hyman, had no idea that Cleburne was really out of action and his forces weren't consolidating to support his efforts. But Bragg insists, hey, we need to press on to Hill. So he reinforces Hyman and Cleburne with 2 divisions from Simon Buckner's Reserve Corps, roughly about 9,500 soldiers. But the lack of daylight intervenes, and Bragg's hopes that the 11th will provide another opportunity. The next day, James Negley's mission now, to point out, was really to take Lafayette, which is further east, with the thought from both Rosecrans and the Union leadership that Braxton Bragg was retreating. But certainly it was not the case. And so when Negley comes up here east of the Crossroads, he sees what's occurring at Dug Gap, sees his threat here, and says, this is definitely not a force that is withdrawing from the area. I need to turn around and boot scoot back over Lookout Mountain. Recognizes that threat and begins to do so. But Bragg to Hyman sends a message. Bragg to Hyman sends a message to him, says that it's highly important that you should finish the movement now going on as quickly as possible. It is important now to move vigorously and crush him, being Negley. But Hyman is skittish. He is beginning to feel threats to his flanks coming from the north. Begins to get concerned. Some back and forth messages between Hyman and Bragg continue. But one message, however, says, if you find the enemy in such force as to make an attack imprudent, fall back at once upon Lafayette. Again, that is a direction that way, away from Negley. So it's interesting. In one message, he says, attack vigorously, crush him. The next message he says, hey, if it's not the right thing to do, if you don't think it's correct, then withdraw. An hour later, he sends another note informing Hyman that the safe path of retreat is now available. And so if you're Hyman and he's a senior commander on the ground, and you receive this message, you're beginning to think that this is what the boss wants me to do. And so he and Simon Buckner get together, have a little council of war, and they both agree, hey, we need to withdraw out of the area. And that's what occurs. Hyman is eventually relieved of command for this decision and charged with disobedience of orders, but Bragg was also culpable. You think about, again, going to leadership, communications, authority, making sure that your commander's intent is being followed and executed. Didn't happen. Dave Powell wrote, quote, Bragg's best chance to defeat a portion of the Union Army piecemeal before Rosecrans reunited his scattered army was lost. But both Thomas and Rosecrans now realized that Bragg was not fleeing towards Rome, Georgia, but he was ready to fight. Thomas moves north. And orientation here, folks. This right here is the Lafayette Road. sort of the key artery, I guess, running north and south to Chattanooga in that direction. Crawfish Springs was Rosecrans' headquarters right there, Lee and Gordon's Mills, and McDonald House and McDonald Farm. This is now today the Visitor Center. And so as we look at the element here, elements of control, we look at direction, which provides subordinate forces their task and instructs them to cooperate within a broader concept of operations. Now, September 18th, Rosecrans now realizes that a Confederate force was attempting to interpose itself between Chattanooga and his army. He could lose Chattanooga. Now, this right here is the West Chickamauga Creek you see right here. And Braxton Bragg's plan, in its simplest form, was to drive west and then turn south and drive Rosecrans' army back into McLemore's Cove against Lookout Mountain and Pigeon Mountain, where it could be destroyed. That was the hope. That was the expectation. So Rosecrans meets with Thomas at Crawfish Springs, his headquarters, and directs that Thomas's corps, the largest 4 divisions and 18,000 strong, orders a night march with those 2 leading divisions, the first and 3rd divisions of the 14th Corps, to conduct a night march up to the Kelly farmstead right here. So now, instead of Bragg massing on the Union left for a dawn attack, a left flank he thought was around perhaps Lee and Gordon's Mill, he has now posed, a Union force has now placed itself on Bragg's own right flank. So certainly some challenges there. And this night march here, it took all night. It's only about 8 miles, but it was the accordion effect that you have with such a large group of men. I've been in it numerous times. And some quotes here from a couple of captains. You see here, whole country is alive with soldiers pushing forward as rapidly as the narrow roads would permit. And on each side of the road, there were fences, and the soldiers would take those fences down and burn them to guide the way. And so you see here, the whole heavens were lighted up by the flames that were coming from the fences that they had burned. And I think it's important to point out also, folks, that Crawfish Springs right here was the only water source for the Union Army. And I cannot underscore that enough, how critical that is. 7 of the 10 Union hospitals were set up with 1 mile of Crawfish Springs because of that water source. Jim Ogden, who is the chief historian at the battlefield, basically says after Tullahoma, Rosecrans' operations was really going from one water source to another, and that's probably very accurate. So if you're Rosecrans and you have Chattanooga to the north going in that direction, your hospitals are down here, you got a fight right here in the middle. You have to keep that in mind when making a decision on how you're going to fight this battle. And if you have to withdraw back to Chattanooga, you're going to have all these wounded soldiers, all these wounded men down here on the southern end of the battlefield on your right flank. How are you going to take care of them? And rushing forward, there were about 2,500 to 3,000 Union soldiers captured at those hospitals after the battle when Rosecrans moves north to occupy Chattanooga once again. Plus, there had been a year-long drought. That certainly went into play. But the fighting on the 19th, again, I talked about Bragg's plan. The fighting on the 19th was basically Bragg's desire to rid himself of this pesky threat to his rear so he could execute his orders to drive south. It got to the point pretty much that both his strategy and his organization would have to change. And we're going to take a look at that. So reorganization, orders process. You look at feedback. Let's see if this will come up. Yeah, let me go back here. So Braxton Bragg divides his army into 2 wings. The right wing under Leonidas Polk and the left wing under newly arrived Lieutenant General James Longstreet, who got to Bragg's headquarters at about 2300 that night on the 19th. about 7 hours before the attacks were to start on Sunday the 20th. And what I'm going to be examining here is feedback. Feedback is a reciprocal flow of information that leads to a shared understanding among all participants. Reciprocal here, folks, is key. Up and down the chain of command. Reinforcements from Longstreet's corps, his men were slowly arriving on the 18th and 19th. Swell Bragg's numbers up to 70,000. 5 infantry and 2 cavalry corps, 11 divisions. But on the night of the 19th, Bragg does not meet with all of his commanders. He only meets with Polk at about 9 o'clock that evening. Rosecrans had an entire council of war meeting with all of his commanders. Bragg chose not to. Again, the army is divided into 2 wings. Bragg's order for the 20th was, quote, to assail the enemy on our extreme right at day dawn on the 20th, to take up the attack in succession to the left. The left wing was to wait by the right, wait the attack by the right, and take it up promptly when made. And so let me point out here, John Breckinridge right here is basically his division that was to initiate the assault, the attack on the right wing of the Confederates against the Union left. Now Breckinridge is with Polk most of the evening and early morning hours of the 20th. And there are different opinions on if Polk relayed attack orders to Breckinridge. Some saying Polk only offered vague instructions. Nevertheless, Hill was to initiate the assault, Benjamin Cheatham to his left, again in succession. And Polk is at his headquarters at Alexander's Bridge, right here. That's where Polk's headquarters is. Sends couriers out to find Hill rather. The couriers do not find Hill to deliver the attack orders. Hill is with Benjamin Cheatham up around the Winfrey Field not Cheatham, but Claiborne, up around the Winfrey Field where Claiborne had conducted a night attack on the 19th. Hill is getting an after-action review from the brigade commanders. Is that what a corps commander should be doing? Anyway, the courier cannot find Hill to provide him the attack orders. Sunrise day dawn was 5:47 a.m. Hill eventually got some rest, finally arrives at Alexander's Bridge very early in the morning, or late in the morning, I guess. The sentry who was there to direct Hill to Polk's headquarters had departed. There's no one there to guide Hill to Polk's wagon, to his tent. So Hill simply leaves, tells an aide to inform Polk that if Polk wants me, I will be on the line. So you have about a 3-hour delay, 3+ hour delay in the attack that was supposed to begin at day dawn. And you think about what occurred during that time. Thomas is able to bring in reinforcements, some. Union forces on the line are able to strengthen their own defenses against this impending Confederate attack. Time is wasted, but again, feedback, reciprocal flow of information that leads to a shared understanding among all participants. Yes, Bragg had delivered orders, directed orders to Polk, and had met with Longstreet as well, but there was no up and down the chain of command to ensure understanding of what those orders were, what the commander's intent was for the morning of the 20th. Did not occur, a failure, and it starts at the top, works its way down. And obviously this did not happen. And you look at the orders, communications. And again, orientation, folks, the Lafayette Road. And this is now the morning of the 20th, right here. Rosecrans, like I mentioned, held a council of war with his commanders at Widow Glen House on the 19th. Thomas was so tired, he fell asleep during most of the meetings, and whenever he was awake, and he would simply say, I would strengthen the left. He was assured that's where the attack was going to come from, and he was certainly right. Rosecrans knows that Bragg is going to attack him, so hey, we're going to remain on the defensive. And during the meeting, Thomas is assured that James Negley would support him in the morning. Okay, so that's some more reinforcements on his left, up around the Visitor House today. Sunday morning, the 20th, Negley doesn't arrive. Thomas begins to question. No one had told him to move. He had not received any orders. James Garfield, chief of staff, yes, future president, writes to bring the division to his left, quote, at once. Meanwhile, Rosecrans is riding up and down his line, inspecting defenses, making decisions, instructing commanders. 0800, James Negley, you see him right here, begins to move out of position on the line, but is reprimanded by Rosecrans for moving without being properly relieved. Okay, he was on the front line down around this area right here. That's where Negley was initially in the morning. So he's reprimanded by Rosecrans. About 0900, he lines Thomas Wood's division right here as Negley's replacement. But it takes some time for Wood to get into position. Rosecrans gets antsy. At around 9 o'clock, Wood's division finally replaced Negley's 2 brigades. 1 brigade had already gone forward. And you see this brigade right here, Betty's division, which has positioned itself just right where the Visitor Center is today. So that brigade had taken off. Negley's other 2 brigades followed suit shortly thereafter. So Wood, as you probably have, many of you heard the story before, is going to fill the line between John Brannan's division to the north, and we have Jeff Davis to the south, right along here. Yes, Jeff Davis, a Union general named Jefferson Davis. How ironic that is. So in all, roughly 1/3 of Rosecrans' army was on the move between 8 and 9 in the morning. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. Meanwhile, Thomas again is getting antsy once again. At 10:30, he sends Captain Sanford Kellogg, his nephew and aide, ordering Brannan right here to move to his assistance, move to the left to support Thomas. You look at situational understanding. Thomas thinks Brannan is in reserve, is not aware that Brannan is on the front line. But Kellogg reaches Brannan, gives him the order for Thomas. Brannan meets with Reynolds, says, I think I can hold it. The Confederate attack has not yet started. Reynolds says, I think I can hold it. Why don't you go ahead and move out? But right when Brannan begins to move, the attack begins. Brannan stays put. He holds fast on the line. Meanwhile, Kellogg had gone off to Rosecrans' headquarters, informing him that with Brannan moving, Reynolds' right flank was going to be in the air. There's going to be a gap here where after Brannan left. Now, James Garfield wrote most of the orders, if not all the orders, during the battle, during the campaign. In this instance, he was busy. Did not write this particular order. Major Frank Bond writes it down, and it says, quote, the general commanding directs you to close up on Reynolds as fast as possible and support him. Gives it to Lieutenant Colonel Lynn Starling, who's Crittenden's chief of staff, writes Gallup on it to go make way, and rides out to give that order to the subordinates. But there's a problem with it. When Wood receives the order, he recognizes it, as does McCook, who is, because of how this order was written, there was confusion. Now, Alexander McCook, like I mentioned, the Corps commanders with Wood, reviews the order. He offered Wood assurance he would fill the gap with Jeff Davis's division, and probably assumed that Rosecrans probably knows more about the overall operational picture than we do. He said, Thomas, I think you ought to go ahead and move out. Well, Thomas does that and leaves a 700-yard gap in the line, 7 football fields wide, and in pours at that time, a little after 11. You see here on the right, Longstreet's force of 8 Confederate brigades, led by Bushrod Johnson's division, packed across 5 lines and 70 acres. The time is just again after 11 on Sunday morning. One of the brigade commanders said this about the breakthrough, and I'll let you read that. Like an avalanche on my right flank, overpowering, simultaneous. I mean, those adjectives right there certainly gives description of what the attack was. Henry Boynton, 35th Ohio, don't know, was really the father of the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. put it all together in the 1890s. Led a regiment, 35th Ohio, like I said said at 9 o'clock that Sabbath, service of all the gods of war began. It broke full tune with its infernal music over the Union left. That morning service continued there until noon. Communications, folks, up and down, again, feedback up and down the chain of command about how that resulted in Longstreet's breakthrough, wood moving, and certainly one of the decisive elements. And so you see here, this is a South Carolina monument. This is the Brotherton cabin. So Longstreet is going to come this way. Rosecrans headquarters is right here. He had moved to the 20th. And you look at this quote here from Bushrod Johnson, who was the lead division. He gives a very vivid and descriptive saying of what he saw take place with the breakthrough as they're rushing past the Brotherton cabin and they're moving north. Again, certainly a very flowery language there. Glitter of arms, fields flooded with sunlight, whistling balls and grape shot made up a battle scene of unsurpassed grandeur. One of these civilians that was accompanying the Army of the Cumberland was Charles Dana, who was the Assistant Secretary of War. And he was with Rosecrans at his headquarters right about here. There's a monument up there to his headquarters. And Dana said, "I was awakened by the most infernal noise I ever heard. Never in any battle I had witnessed was there such a discharge of cannon and musketry. The first thing I saw was General Rosecrans crossing himself. Hello, I said to myself. If the general is crossing himself, we are in a desperate situation." Indeed. John Turchin, Union General, when he was talking about later on after the execution of that Wood did with the order, said Wood should have taken the few minutes to gain clarity from Rosecrans if he knew that order was wrong, if he knew that he would be leaving a gap, particularly since he was fully aware of the presence of enemy forces to his left. And one thing I need to highlight also is the importance of rest and sleep for commanders. Glenn Tucker in his book wrote, Rosecrans was operating almost certainly from mental strain and physical exhaustion. The anxiety during the days when the Army was divided and vulnerable had been a severe trial for him. Certainly on the second day of Chickamauga, he was not the general of Rich Mountain, Iuka, Corinth, or Stones River. Could that perhaps have led to the miscommunication, the mistakes written in that communique to Wood about close up and support? Could have been that fatigue, that mental strain that was taking place, perhaps not just with him, but also the headquarters personnel as well. Perhaps. So as Longstreet moves, heads up towards Snodgrass Hill, the vast majority of them do, at least. Some turn due west. John B. Hood, of course, is wounded in the right leg, and he's out of command, but that's probably a story for another day. And this is a view from that South Carolina monument looking due south. So if your Union brigade, Harker's brigade, was located up here, the line stretching down to the Glen Kelly Road, you can just imagine thousands and thousands of Confederate soldiers screaming, doing the rebel yell, moving in this direction. I'm sure that was quite the scene. The last section I'm going to be talking about, my friends, is this right here: elements of command, responsibility, and leadership. Responsibility simply is commanders legally and ethically responsible for their decisions and actions, accomplishments, and failures. Leadership, influencing people by providing purpose, direction, and motivation while operating to accomplish a mission. And of course, if you've been to Chickamauga, this is a picture of Snodgrass Hill, Snodgrass Cabin. I told you in the beginning that Gordon Granger was the reserve commander. He was located north of the battlefield, up around Rossville. He'd been in reserve status. Rosecrans had told him the night before on the 19th, said, quote, "You must help us in the fight tomorrow by supporting Thomas." And as the fighting intensified, Granger turned to his chief of staff, said, "Why the bleep does Rosecrans keep us here? There is nothing in front of us. There is the battle." And on his own initiative, really without written orders or verbal orders for that matter, Granger leaves one brigade and moves south with two brigades towards the battlefield, towards the sounds of the guns. And this is Granger and Thomas meeting each other on the battlefield. So you can see here, here's Granger. Here's the division commander right there with his two brigades on the Union right flank, just at the nick of time. Dozens of Confederate attacks on Snodgrass Hill, Horseshoe Ridge. Early afternoon, Thomas and his staff see growing clouds arising several miles to the north, unsure of who that is. Could it be this guy here, Nathan Bedford Forrest and his cavalry? Unsure. Dispatches a captain to identify who that was. They saw the red, white, and blue crescent-shaped battle flag of Gordon Granger. Again, he arrived with two brigades, about 4,000 men and 100,000 rounds of ammunition, much needed ammunition. You see John Brandon here to his left. He wrote after, he said, "The opportune arrival of Major General Granger's command saved the army from total rout. Being left my own resources by General Negley, whom I supposed to be on my right, I could not have held my position against another attack had not General Granger's troops got into position to prevent my being flanked on my right." Taking responsibility, folks. Marching to the sounds of the guns. Taking initiative. Certainly what we expect of leaders. Certainly what the 1st Cav commander on Desert Storm expected of his leaders. And I think what Granger demonstrated. And you look at leadership, Thomas as well. Numerous accounts of inspiring soldiers from various units during the many Confederate charges. He held firm. So much so, the 14th Corps that he led, that their symbol became the acorn because they stood like oaks during the Battle of Chickamauga. So ends the Battle of Chickamauga, the second largest battle in the Civil War, folks. 37,000 casualties, 4,000 killed, 27,000 wounded, 5 million bullets fired, 11,000 rounds of artillery fired. September 20th at 4 p.m., our good old Charles Dana once again sends a note to Washington. Quote, "My report today is of deplorable importance. Chickamauga is as fatal name in our history as Bull Run." Not very positive for sure. But 4 hours later, he sends out another dispatch, not as sour an outlook. He says, "I am happy to report that my dispatch of 4 p.m. today proves to have given too dark a view of our disaster. The latest report from Thomas that he was driving back the advance of the rebels." But he also had positive things to say about Rosecrans as well. But I think, my friends, that Lieutenant Ambrose Bierce captured the end of the fighting, I think, in just a great way, as they heard the rebel yell through the darkening woods as Thomas begins to withdraw from the battlefield, head towards Chattanooga. Lieutenant Bierce wrote, "It was taken up," talking about the rebel yell, "it was taken up successively and passed around our front, along a ride and behind us again, until it seemed almost to have gotten to the point where it started. It was the ugliest sound that any mortal ever heard. Even a mortal exhausted and unnerved, 2 days of hard fighting, without sleep, without rest, without food, without hope. There was, however, a space somewhere at the back of us, which that harbor yell did not prolong itself to, and through which we finally retired in profound silence, dejection, and unmolested." And so ended the Battle of Chickamauga. And so as we looked at these elements here, folks, Bragg's authority at McLemore's Cove, some of the problems he had with some of his subordinates there and not executing orders. Look at responsibility. I talked about that. Gordon Granger taking responsibility, showing initiative, marching to the sounds of the guns. Decision making. William Rosecrans, "I'm going to move my army to the south of Chattanooga, not to the north." A risk there, perhaps a gamble. Very decisive. Leadership, Thomas at Snodgrass Hill. You look at this other elements, these elements here, both Rosecrans and Bragg. Is this where we want to fight? Do we want to fight at Chickamauga? Didn't expect so. Feedback, Bragg's orders on the 20th, for the 20th. Yes, the orders went down, but didn't go back up the chain of command. Back briefs, making sure your subordinates know what their orders are for the mission to execute. It rests at the top. Joseph Wheeler, Confederate cavalry operations, how they were able to sneak across the Tennessee River, the mountains, how he organized and his force, a large, robust mounted force. Errors there. And communications, again, the breakthrough. These are the sources I use, folks. Volume 30 of the ORs that discuss the Chickamauga campaign and battle. Dave Powell's 2 books, Decisions at Chickamauga and Failure in the Saddle, which gets into, of course, Wheeler and Forrest. William Good Robertson's River of Death, and then our friend Lee White from the Park Service, again, bushwhacking on a grand scale. A great overview. And so, my friends, I think with that, Mike, I turn it back over to you, sir, and any questions?
So, Ed, my first question is, why wasn't Gordon Granger said to be the Rock of Chickamauga?
That's a great question. I think when he arrived, because Thomas had obviously organized all the defenses. As these scattered units were beginning to, filtrate back up Snodgrass Hill, Thomas is organizing what he can, those units that he can corral. And it's certainly his leadership, and certainly decisive in placing, those 2 brigades where they need to be placed. So you certainly make an argument for each one. For Granger being the Rock of Chickamauga, probably get no complaint from Thomas, because I believe, that handshake photo I talked about. I think Thomas basically says something, "Sir, you've saved the Army." I think words to that effect. So.
All right. So Barry says, good day.
Good day.
From down under, first week of winter in Melbourne. And John says it doesn't feel like winter in Toronto. I wonder why. Roy says the foul weather is finally clearing out of LA. In fact, it was both breezy and sunny for a change and no rain. Jerry says General David Stanley was from Wayne County, Ohio, my county. The McCooks were from Carrollton, 50 miles southeast, and General Rosecrans from down near Columbus, Ohio, 70 miles southwest. He also says, I visited the Chickamauga battlefield area on the 150th anniversary in 2013.
Yeah.
A great visit and great job, Ed. Thank you.
Yeah. Stanley wasn't at Chickamauga. I think he got sick. He was certainly part of the campaign, but Robert Mitchell pretty much takes over Cav operations from Stanley. I'm not sure when Stanley got sick or when he became, out of commission. Not sure.
Michael says Negley was blamed for poor performance in this battle. Do you think this was justified?
I don't think it was. I really don't. Especially when you look at what happened at Davis's Crossroads, for one, he certainly makes a very prudent decision with what he's facing to the north and east, with the Confederate forces. And there was another division behind him that was coming down, but certainly on the 20th, certainly not justified at all, in my opinion, because he does. Sends up Bay's brigade to the Union left, and he moves out when he can, but he's following orders like a lot of the commanders are at that time. And Rosecrans on 20 is not a very patient man. So.
And Steve says, excellent talk. Thanks.
Yeah.
Joe says, did Longstreet drop the ball at Snodgrass Hill? He wanted an independent command, and had he taken charge there, he might have earned it. Thomas stepped up.
Now, Dave Powell will say that Longstreet had the orders were in place, that he did not need to exercise tactical leadership. But when John Bell Hood fell, with his right leg wound, there really was nobody there taking command of the Confederate forces that are rushing towards Snodgrass Hill, Horseshoe Ridge. Longstreet is famously having sweet potato and Nassau bacon, for lunch as the attack is going forward. And Kershaw, for example, Kershaw and Bushrod Johnson argue about data rank, who's in charge, etc. So there really is no guiding hand for those attacks. So in my view, I think Longstreet was not at his best during that time. And I got a book coming out in September with Savas Bay that talks about Longstreet's First Corps in East Tennessee campaign post Chattanooga.
Carol says, excellent presentation. And
Thanks,
this
General.
is a non-Civil War related question. What is the significance of the horse on the Desert Storm patch?
Well, that goes back to post Civil War, 7th Cav. Those horsemen there fighting in the West. And I want to say the horse, the actual symbol though on the patch, or the first Cav patch, comes from the Korean War, if I'm not mistaken. When the first Cav was over there. I'm not much, I don't have a lot of knowledge on first Cav history, but I think that's where it comes. But that goes all the way back to post Civil War against the Native Americans.
And the fact that it was a cavalry unit.
Cavalry unit, correct? Yeah, it was.
So our buddy Rob says, with who do you lay primary responsibility for the failure at Chickamauga?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Veterans after the battle, both North and South became somewhat frustrated because they didn't really see a reason why that battle was fought in the first place, because Chattanooga remained in Union hands. I think there's a lot of validity to that argument on both sides. You look at strategic and operational objectives, Chattanooga was certainly the key, and that remained on the side of the North. And so, but I think to your question, you got to look at the orders process, look at communications, look kind of what I went over, especially on the 20th. That was it. That's probably the simplest way I can answer that question. Just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and just kind of fate took over. So, but I think it starts at the top, starts at Rosecrans. But again, I underscore and highlighting, he was so exhausted, so tired, to my point about the importance of sleep and rest, even for commanders. And, and during my time in the 26 years in the Army, that's something we battled with also. Commanders got to get rest. And I think it impacted his decision-making abilities on the 20th.
Yeah, that certainly stuck out when you were talking about Thomas going to sleep. So Jim says, thank you. I enjoyed the talk. And Frank says, here we go. What is your opinion of Rosecrans and Garfield at the abandonment of the field? Was it Garfield's idea, or did Rosecrans panic? And finally, was Dana's first report of any effect?
Lot packed in there. I think there is some in the Civil War historiography coming out. Frank Varney has written a book about the Grant-Rosecrans relationship, which I think is pretty insightful. There are supporters from Thomas down that supported what Rosecrans, how he operated tactically in the field. And I think even Garfield and Charles Dana after the war apologized to Rosecrans for how they treated him in some of their communications and some of their letters and some of how they were talking about Rosecrans's tactical and operational aspects, his decisions during Chickamauga and certainly after that. Garfield was a political general. and the old adage that, Rosecrans and Garfield have this meeting on the field. Rosecrans starts shooting out orders that Garfield's going to have to accomplish in Chattanooga. Garfield says, "Boss, I don't understand what you're saying. I think you ought to go forward in Chattanooga and organize, and I'll send this message back down to Thomas." So there are varying accounts of how that discussion went. But again, I think in Civil War historiography, I think some of the current books and writers are starting to come around to be more supportive of Rosecrans for what he did. And was Charles Dana's first report any effect? Well, I think, unfortunately, in a lot of the books that are written, his 4 o'clock report is the only one that is talked about, which says that, this is going to be in line with, the Battle of Bull Run. And they do not talk about the second report that was 4 hours later that really commends Rosecrans for how he conducted himself on the field much longer. So it's very positive. And what Frank Varney does in his book is basically say this is Rosecrans, Garfield, or Grant. It goes all the way back to Iuka, goes all back to Corinth and all of that when those two butted heads. That is probably a separate briefing and presentation in and of itself for the Congress about the relationship between those two.
Right. And you have another comment that says, "Excellent presentation. Thanks, Colonel Lowe."
Yes, sir.
And Bob asks, was there something in Rosecrans' background from previous battle experiences that could help one foresee the debacle at Chickamauga?
Wow. Whew. Yeah, I am. I got to scratch my brain on that one. I mean, you look at his performance in Iuka, there in Corinth, you look at Stones River, look at the Tullahoma campaign, which was a brilliant operation. I really don't think so, but I think it goes back to what I said earlier, that Rosecrans was so worn down mentally, physically, that he just wasn't operating, at full speed at 100%. And I think that just took its toll. That's probably the best answer I got.
So Rob says, with whom do you conclude holds primary responsibility for communication failure on the Confederate side?
I think of General Bragg. I mean, if I'm the senior commander, I'm going to, like I said, he met with Polk, but he did not issue any written orders. I may not have said that. Rosecrans does. Bragg does not. Did not meet with all of his commanders. Even, he meets with Longstreet separately. Doesn't meet with Polk. So I think it rests with him. I really do. I think it rests at the top. But, that whole command climate in the Army of Tennessee was as bad as it was, as Bragg and Polk couldn't stand each other. And, he relieves Polk after Chickamauga because of the failure on the 20th. So, there's something else there. So, but I think it starts at the top.
And George says, "Dear Colonel Lowe, informative and excellent presentation. Thank you." And Steve says, "How close did Chickamauga come to a total disaster and destruction of the U.S. Army rather than a tactical and operational defeat?"
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about a lot of battles, in the Civil War, both East and Western theater, and you talk about, near destruction, near disaster, destruction of an army. And, I think if, when I read the reports, some of the Union commanders, Thomas, for example, Granger, they didn't see it that way. A lot of the soldiers didn't either. They were still, and some of the earlier books had painted such a negative picture about the Army of the Cumberland during and after Chickamauga that may not be justified, because they see that, was it close? Was it near disaster, total near destruction? Possibly, but I mean, rarely occurred in the Civil War at all. Perhaps the Army of Tennessee at Nashville, where the Army, where they pretty much got destroyed by George Thomas, once again. the Rock of Chickamauga. So it was a near thing. I think it was close. But again, you look at some decisions that like George Pickett said after Gettysburg, I think the Union has something to do with it also. And I think Thomas had something to do with, I think the soldiers establishing defenses up on Horseshoe Ridge has something to do with it. Decisions made by division, brigade, and regimental commanders. The 21st Ohio, for example, fired 43,000 rounds of ammunition on Horseshoe Ridge over about 4 or 5 hours. I mean, just incredible defenses. So tenacious, but they were stalwart in their defenses. That's about the best I can put it.
Boy, that hike up Horseshoe Ridge last October with you and Rob and Harold, very impressive.
Yeah.
So John says comments on Forrest's dressing down of Bragg.
Yeah.
Al thinks it's overstated and was impossible to achieve his plans.
Yeah, I agree. There's other things that Forrest said, that he climbed up a tree and saw the Union forces going around Lookout Mountain, and he left out quite a few things of some of the defenses, rear guard actions that the Union forces were leaving as to sort of hold back any Confederate threats that may come up, the 20th and beyond. So yeah, I agree. I think it's overstated very much so.
David says my great grandfather was on Snodgrass Hill till the end.
Wow.
Yeah. Shannon says thank you for an interesting presentation. And Frank says thank you for your answer as well as the presentation. I enjoyed and learned. And Bob says very well organized and very well presented. As always, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate it, y'all.
Well, Colonel, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you at 2nd Manassas in October.
Well, we'll see. I'm going to Little Bighorn at the end of August and early September. Then I got the Emerging Civil War Conference in August. So, I'm not going to be at the Congress because I'm going to be prepping for Little Bighorn. So my apologies. So.
Well, I tell you, that's a great place to walk and to listen to the breeze.
Well, we got 2 days. We got a guy for 2 days, and we got a Native American who's going to give us the Indian perspective on one day. And we're going to go down to the Fetterman Massacre and the box wagon fight. It's going to be good full days, 4 full days of around the battlefield. So look forward to it.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you once again. And ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to seeing you at another Civil War Roundtable Congress event. Good night, everyone.